let's jump across and learn a bit more now about the national funding platform. It might be something that you're hearing about for the first time. Hopefully we can share some really good information now with you over the next 10 minutes with Maree so you can understand the opportunity. Maree, thank you so much for being here on the show. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Julia. Lovely to be here. Lovely to be on a panel with Natalie, one of my favourite people in philanthropy. And Australian Communities Foundation and FRRR do very similar work. So it's nice to share insights and learnings, and also just acknowledging that I'm coming to you from outer eastern Melbourne on Wurundjeri land.
Beautiful. Excellent. Great to have you here. Well, let's jump into it. When COVID hit, the organisation that you lead, the Australian Communities Foundation, together with Philanthropy Australia, were able to quickly establish a national funding platform to help coordinate that sort of philanthropic response to the pandemic. At a top line to begin with, can you tell us what has been the response for the approach that you've taken?
Sure. Thanks, Julia. So I might just go back one step for those who aren't familiar with Australian Communities Foundation. We're similar to FRRR, an infrastructure foundation, what I call an infrastructure foundation. So we've been around 22 years, very similar age to FRRR. We have a very similar staffing profile, and we're both national. The difference is FRRR has that really strong rural and regional focus, and Australian Communities Foundation, while we can give anywhere, has a really interesting parallel with the majority of our funding often landing in urban communities across Australia. So when I say that we're an infrastructure foundation, we support other people's giving. So we're here and we allow people to set up funds with us, and they can be individuals or families, or foundations, other foundations who want to give through us, or corporates. And so that's the work we do, and our mission is activating a nation of givers to create a fair Australia. So coming back to your question, Julia, around our COVID-19 response, we've had sort of a few different things that we did around COVID-19, but one of our key strategic pillars is to leverage our infrastructure to support giving. And we just fortuitously finished a relaunch of our website, which contained an update of a very old, very clunky previous version of a national funding platform. And we realised in conversation, or I realised in conversation with Sarah Davies, CEO of Philanthropy Australia, at the beginning of COVID, that what we lacked for philanthropy was a place for funders to meet fund seekers and share information, and particularly for fund seekers to post projects that were really, to talk about the need and what their organisation's facing, whether it's core funding or whether it's to pivot to do something differently. And so we agreed that we would partner around creating a national funding platform. And it's a very simple concept, and I'll get you to pull it up and we'll show people a little bit about it. So you go into the Australian Communities Foundation website, head to COVID-19 tab across on the right-hand side, and this is what it looks like. And then when we scroll down, we then ask people to identify as either a funder or a fund seeker. And if we go into the for funders section, that's probably the easiest way to look at the site. So granting opportunities, thanks, Julia. This is what how it appears if you're a not-for-profit organisation and you've wanted to post a project on the site. So we ask you for a very simple description of the project or initiative, or indeed just your organisation, because many people are looking for core funding. We ask you to provide us with a photo and your funding ask, and then we also ask you to identify, to categorise your project. So if we look at the filter section, Julia, it gives people a sense of how we ask you to identify your work. And they're very broad categories, but it allows funders to go in and start to do a bit of a search to find the types of projects that they're looking for. So either you can jump straight into the COVID-19 section, or you can say, look, I want to post something that's broader in any of these categories. So that's the funding platform, and I'm going to answer your next question because I can hear it coming, Julia, which is sort of what's the level of demand been on the site. And I think the really overwhelming thing that we've faced is just seeing how much demand is out there. So the funding platform has been operating since February, and there's currently more than 300 projects on the site, and they represent around $11 million worth of funding requests from all different types and sizes of organisations. So I'll stop there and try not to anticipate your next question, Julia. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I'm just going to sort of overall, what have you noticed in terms of the response? Like 300 projects and $11 million worth of need. Has that surprised you? Has that been a lot in your perspective or your view? What have you noticed sort of at a top line, your observations?
Look, I think it certainly surprised philanthropy in general, just the overwhelming demand for philanthropic foundations at the moment is very stark. And to give people a sense of the sort of usage of the site, we've seen 150% increase in organisations coming to the site and posting projects. So that, and I think that speaks to the asks for philanthropy in general. And Natalie talked to this. You know, one of the really important and I think interesting things to reflect on is that in times like the bushfires, in times like COVID, that's when philanthropic foundations come into their own and play a really vital role in being that broker between fund seekers and funders.
Yeah, beautiful, excellent. And let's jump into, I guess, from a funder's perspective and the use of it from a funder's perspective. The optics that you have on the national funding platform are really from the perspective of Australian Communities Foundation, your donor and funding community. Can you give us a perspective of what you've noticed from your funding community's engagement with the platform?
Sure. So we can give you a look at. We might go to the map of Australia and look at where the projects have come from, and that gives people a bit of a sense of the demand that we've seen and where the hotspots are. So maybe just the slide before that. Yeah, thank you, Julia. So of those 300 projects I talked about, really interesting to see a big peak in both Victoria and New South Wales. And I think if you think about COVID as an issue and how it's been felt across Australia, then that starts to become apparent that, you know, Victoria and New South Wales have definitely felt the brunt of the certainly COVID as a sort of social and economic issue in the early days, and also thinking about the fact that many of those projects and requests are health related. Yeah. We might go to the next slide, and that sort of gives people a little bit more information. These are the types of sectors. So of that $11 million funding ask, about 25% of the asks are coming broadly around social and economic disadvantage. Followed closely by issues around disability or illness, which is again not surprising. And so we'd be grouping things like medical research, etc., into that pot. Then interestingly, a lot of projects around young people and supporting young people, and I think that goes to Natalie's observation around the digital divide and how we're sort of thinking about children and young people who are either in or out of, able to participate in school and education, and then young people who are either living rough, and what that means for responding to homeless young people in a time of COVID. And we've seen some really interesting pivots from some of our homelessness organisations in that space. And then we are thinking about very vulnerable groups at the moment. So and quite a number of projects supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We're all very aware of the impact on remote communities and the absolute devastation that would happen if COVID was appeared in some of our remote communities. So there's been really practical support and great projects and collaborations around providing just essential things like hand sanitizer to remote communities, and that work's been led by the Aboriginal community controlled health organisations who've worked really closely with Philanthropy.
Great, excellent. And in terms of, you've also got a slide here, and thank you for sharing these with us for everyone for today as well. You've got a slide here that talks about the size of the asks as well. Can you talk us through a little bit around that?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I'm hoping people listening will be quite, excited is not the right word, but pleased to see that, both for funders and fund seekers, the asks are quite accessible. So between the majority of the projects fit between sort of $10,000 to $50,000. I think that's also reflective of our capacity as Australian Communities Foundation. Many of our grants are sort of smaller grants. So we give out smaller grants to many rather than larger grants to a few. But I also think that is reflective of the fact that for many community-based organisations at this time, that sort of $10,000 to $50,000 can make a real difference to things like core funding and also to supporting particular projects and initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maree, can you talk us through, in terms of, obviously it's available, the national funding platform is available for any organisation as well as any funder, grant maker, philanthropist that wants to come and actually find projects. My understanding is that you don't have a level of optics on the broader grant making and funding community in terms of what projects they're choosing, but you can see it from the perspective of your donor community and funding within the Australian Communities Foundation. And this speaks a little bit to a question that's popped up in the Q&A, which is, of the 300 funding asks, how many have been funded since February? Can you give us, because you can't answer all of that in its entirety, can you give us some perspective though from what you have seen?
Sure. So I would love to be able to answer that question. And the fact is that no one in Australia has immediate data to where funding's landing in a crisis for the whole philanthropic sector. Philanthropy Australia certainly gets closest in their foundation maps tool, but there's often a lag time between where funders fund and then when they share that data. Certainly for Australian Communities Foundation, what I can talk to, so we've distributed around $600,000 through COVID, and prior to that about 2 million through the bushfires. And what I can show, perhaps on the next slide, Julia, is a comparison. If we use that as a microcosm, remembering that we're an aggregate foundation, so we represent around 1,000 donors, if we can make some assumptions about what that might look like for the sector as a whole. So if we look on the left-hand side, the blue circles represent funding requested and the green circles represent funding distributed of the funding that Australian Communities Foundation knows about. So health and wellbeing really interestingly match up quite well. So demand and distributions are very similar, sitting around 32 to 35%. And so do individual family support and welfare. But there's this really interesting gap between a lot of requests for education and employment, and we're not seeing that need through our lens being met. That certainly doesn't mean that other funders aren't filling that gap. In fact, we know that many foundations have a specific focus on education and employment. I'd love to hear from Natalie on this issue too, in terms of where FRRR's funding's landing. And then very interestingly, a higher level of response from our funding community to research and advocacy. In fact, it exceeds demand. But again, I think that speaks to the type of funding that Australian Communities Foundation donors often lean towards. So that gives us a little bit of a snapshot of what we've seen in terms of the money that's gone out the door to date.
Great, excellent. Well, we've got a lot of interest and a lot of questions starting to come through on the Q&A box. So thank you very much, everybody, for your questions that you're lodging there. And we're going to jump across into them. I'm just popping them the questions that we're going to be answering live so you can see them. You can upvote the questions as well, but we're going to work our way through these together over the next 20 minutes. Thank you for sharing and showing us through the summary as well that you've been able to put together, Maree. That's been fantastic. What we might do now is actually just ask you one last question and then jump across into some of these questions. In terms of what you know about what's coming in terms of the next 3 to 6 months, what other resources either exist or might be coming, or others practical supports available to organisations at this time?
Thanks, Julia. So one of the other roles that we haven't talked about yet that philanthropy plays in a time like this is convening, and we're certainly thinking deeply into how we get behind some key issues that we'll be facing as a community coming out of COVID, and how we collaborate around that. And so we're doing some work bringing think tanks in Australia together at the moment to say, what are you working on, what are you collaborating on, and where aren't you collaborating, and how can we help? We're bringing civil society leaders together to say, what are you facing, and what's the role for philanthropy? And what we're hoping will come out of that is a sense of, a list of key issues that we really need to get behind, and I would like to say fight for, to make sure that we are not missing, as Natalie said, this really important moment in time to get action and shift some quite significant social issues. So I'm talking about things like access to childcare, and we've seen such a huge shift on that. I'm talking about things like change in the sort of new start rate, and we've seen such a massive shift in that in a short space of time. We're thinking about the people who are falling through the cracks at the moment. So people exiting in and out of prison, or people in immigration detention centres. And as Natalie said, the digital divide. And also I would add to that digital rights. There never has there been a time when digital rights have been more important, because we're collecting so much data about people at the moment. And clearly the most obvious example of that is, the COVID-19 health app that people are strongly polarising. So that's just a range of issues, and I think that's from my perspective the sort of leadership role that the foundation will play going forward. In terms of practical support, we're a really open foundation. It is not hard to approach ACF and ask for help. So you do it through the funding platform. That's our gateway. That's how we trawl through that. Our staff look at that daily and find great projects and promote those to our donor community. And that's being accessible and available, I think, and source of advice for not-for-profits is the most important role we can play.
Fantastic, excellent. That's great. Well, I'm just going to just change the screen view here. This is for post-production. Now we can see everyone here again when we have the recording available. So thank you so much for that, Maree. There's a couple of questions here specific to the platform, which I'm just going to go through. We've got about the next 15 minutes to go through these questions together. The first one is, from your experience to date, what is the optimal amount to promote through a platform like this? For example, does it work well for a $15,000 ask and not for a $200,000 ask, or does it make no difference? If you could give us some views there, please.
I think this question, so there's a short and a longer answer to this question. I think the short answer is sort of smaller asks are always more accessible in a many-to-many environment, because if you think about sort of who sits behind Australian Communities Foundation and the cohort of other trusts and foundations who will be dipping into this platform, they're probably likely to be looking for a list of maybe 5 or so organisations that they want to give money to. So that goes to sort of keeping the asks reasonable. But I do know that there are very large institutional funders who are using this platform who have great capacity. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't post the larger asks. I think it comes back to the organisation. So large larger not-for-profits are often going to be wanting larger grants because that's more cost efficient for them, and smaller community-based organisations often aren't asking for as much money. So, and that funder will look to the type of organisation it is to actually think about what is reasonable in those circumstances.
Yeah, great, fantastic, excellent. Hopefully that answers your question there. There is a specific question around how many of the 300 funding asks have been funded since February, and I know that you can't answer that, but to try and answer that question as much as possible, do you have a sense in terms of a rate or a percentage in terms of them actually being funded that you're getting in terms of feedback as yet?
So I should explain to people why we can't answer that question. And it's not that we're trying to be evasive here. It's just that we only have a line of sight to the money that goes out the door from Australian Communities Foundation, so from our donor community. And that is around 50 or so projects to date have been funded through our foundation. What I can't tell you is what other funders are doing with this information and whether or not they're funding the projects that they're seeing on the platform, because it's not built into the platform to have that feedback mechanism. So I cannot tell you. I would love to be able to tell you this is a real gap for philanthropy, as we said at the start, in terms of collecting that in a timely fashion where money's landing in the community.
Sure. I guess it probably speaks to people also wanting to kind of make that assessment from that type of question as to the, is this worth my time? Is this worth us, in a space where time is limited at the moment, is this worth us putting it up on there? I'm going to ask that question on behalf of everybody. Obviously the answer would be yes, get it up there. You've got to have that level of visibility. But what sort of time is involved, Maree, in actually posting up a project just on average?
Thanks for asking, because I was about to say that less than half an hour. We've kept it so short. It's really deliberate. A short paragraph, a funding request, a photo, and more information that you can post. So you can link to a proposal if you'd like to, but you don't have to. You can just link to your website. So it's specifically designed for donors to trawl through or funders to trawl through and contact the person if they want more information. So we're not wasting people's time. So I would say it's probably not an unreasonable amount of time.
Yeah, great. So to answer Katrina's question here, and Katrina, I'm going to just mould your question a little bit. Katrina's asked how many funders have contacted you to say that they want to fund a project, and are you seeing strong engagement from funders with the platform? Again, just to reiterate what you've just said as well, is that you really can only see it from the optics of your donor community. But when a project is posted onto the platform, in terms of then engaging back with your donor community, is that something that you're sort of actively reviewing and then being able to connect projects? Are you doing some of that sort of manual work in the background as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what we have a grants team of 5 people, and that's what they do. That's their how they spend a lot of their time at the moment, which is connecting funders and fund seekers. I can tell you, to give people heart, that I've had a lot of anecdotal feedback from a range of foundations across the country who are going to the platform and choosing projects from it and taking it to their trustees. I just can't tell you how many. Okay. But I think the other thing that people were asking, which I think is a good question, is around operational, so core funding versus project funding.
Yes.
We've seen a really great uplift in donors and funders recognising the importance of core funding. And I know I can see Natalie nodding as well, and funders are really very aware at the moment that capacity building funding, core funding, is so important.